Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shane Coleman. I'll be your MC for today. We're absolutely delighted you could all be with us for this webinar. It's great to welcome delegates from across higher education, government and enterprise. Now, today we are here to discuss the key role universities have in shaping the future development of our country and economy, both through their work in nurturing the graduate talent pool and in providing capacity for cutting-edge research for the knowledge economy. Now, we've seen over the past couple of years, universities have made a major contribution to the national response to the COVID crisis and will play an important role in Ireland's post-COVID recovery. Unlike other countries, I think it's fair to say we haven't had enough of experts here in Ireland. Now, we do have closed captioning available today. Each delegate can alter the size of those captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of their screen. We are delighted to be joined by our keynote speaker on Tánaiste, Leo Varadkar, TD Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, by Professor Andrew Deeks, President of UCD, and by our panellists, Catherine Duffy, Professor David Fitzpatrick, and Anne Herity. More from our panellists in a few moments. They can now turn off their video and mute themselves, and they can rejoin us in a couple of moments. To formally kick things off, though, can I ask Professor Andrew Deeks, President of UCD and Chair of the IUA, for his opening comments. Andrew.
As Chair of the Irish Universities Association, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this important webinar on the role of universities in shaping the development of our country and economy. On behalf of the IUA, I would particularly like to welcome on Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and of course our distinguished panellists, Catherine Duffy, Professor David Fitzpatrick, and Anne Herity, along with everyone else who has joined us here today. Over my 8 years in Ireland and leading UCD, I've realised just how important Irish universities are to the country, to the economy, and particularly to the people of Ireland. This is reflected in Ireland having the highest rate of participation in university-level education in the EU, and the attractiveness of Ireland to foreign direct investment. University research and spin-out innovation activity contribute to development here and around the world. It's appropriate that we articulate the important role universities have played and will play in shaping the development of Ireland at a time when a new HEA Act is being debated and when assurances have been given that the issue of sustainable funding for universities is finally to be addressed. The one constant over the 8 years I've been leading UCD has been the failure of consecutive governments to grasp the nettle of sustainable funding for Irish universities. Back in 2014, the year I started, the then Minister for Education and Skills, Rory Quinn, established an expert group to look into the question of sustainable funding for Irish universities. That group produced an excellent report which both quantified the funding need and provided options for delivering that funding. The Cassell's report has yet to be acted on. Just as we're coming to the end of the pandemic years, I hope we're also coming to the end of years of procrastination about the funding and governance of Irish universities, and that the contribution universities can make to the development of the country and the economy will be understood, facilitated, and enabled through appropriate arrangements. I believe the discussions in this webinar will be an important step in building a shared understanding of the national contributions of the Irish universities, and I look forward to hearing from on Tánaiste and from our distinguished panellists. Welcome once again.
Thank you indeed, Professor Deeks, for that. I'd like to, without any further ado, introduce our guest speaker today. He is the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. He is the Tánaiste. He is TD for Dublin West and, of course, leader of Fine Gael. He was the youngest ever Taoiseach of this country from June 2017 to June 2020, an office he is due to return to at the end of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, Leo Varadkar.
Well, thanks, Shane, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the association and Jim Miley in particular for inviting me to take part in your webinar today. I want to start by acknowledging Professor Andrew Deeks for his exemplary commitment and dedication as President of UCD, and I'm sure I can speak for everyone who's involved in the webinar today that we wish him every success on his departure after many years of service to the Irish higher education sector, and also to every success in his new chapter back home in Australia. I think it's fair to say that Andrew, during his term at the helm of UCD, really brought it to a higher level, both in terms of academic performance and financial performance. And we really appreciate the contribution that you've made to Irish higher education, and hope you'll continue to be a friend and continue to be in touch in the years ahead. As you know, on Friday, the 21st of January, following public health advice, the government agreed that most of the public health restrictions currently in place could be removed. The efforts of Irish people, particularly younger people, over recent weeks to reduce social contacts and to take care when they met others, combined with a very high uptake of vaccines, has made a huge difference. It's been a very long 2 years. The pandemic has brought tragedy to our nation, with over 9,000 lives lost north and south. Millions of lives have been disrupted, and for the students attending your universities, crucial rites of passage, from the Leaving Cert to Freshers' Week to graduation ceremonies to studying on campus, couldn't happen. So much was done online, and in some cases things didn't happen at all. I think we shouldn't forget that isolation, anxiety, fear and loneliness, as well as hope, solidarity and resilience, have been hallmarks of the pandemic. But I think now we enter a period of hope, a period in which we can look forward cautiously to a spring and summer of freedom, knowing that there will be bumps in the road ahead, but confident that if this is not the end, it is certainly the beginning of the end. I think throughout the last 2 years, college authorities have managed, by and large, to maintain first-class higher education provision for students, despite huge challenges, particularly in the early and most unsettling period of the pandemic. Before I came here today, or joined you on this call today, I was launching a new investment fund for startups in Tangent and Trinity. And I have to say, one of the best things to see was students on campus again. And I really hope that students will gain from the return to campus experience, that we'll continue to benefit from what we've learned in terms of doing things online. But also, if you're able to maybe make up for some of the things that couldn't get done. Certainly, I know some universities are going to do in-person graduation ceremonies retrospectively, in addition to the ones that were done online. And I really hope that you're all able to do those types of things, because it was a very tough year for people to spend 2 years of their college life in a box room or in student accommodation rather than on campus. But I know you'll take that on board. I know from Minister Harris and his officials that they've been engaging with the association and THEA throughout the pandemic. And I know that you're committed to a full return to campus teaching and learning, and that you're committed to doing that safely, as are we. So I want to thank you all for the successful provision of higher education around the country. It hasn't been an easy road, and there have been challenges along the way. It required additional effort and innovation and dedication to navigate these challenges, but you have done it. I'm also very appreciative of the other roles that higher education institutions have played. University campuses continued to host vaccination centres and contact tracing centres, and that made an enormous impact on our ability to protect our citizens. And of course, we borrowed some of your brightest brains. Professor Breen McCrath, for example, former president of DCU, overseeing the vaccine effort, and also Professor Philip Nolan, former president of Maynooth, overseeing the modelling. So I think all of this has helped to once again highlight what we already knew, that higher education is an asset, and it's also crucial to the well-being of our country, to social progress and economic progress. Our people, particularly young people, remain the cornerstone on which our continued success and prosperity as a progressive nation relies. Your role in readying talented and skilled graduates, well-rounded, engaged individuals with good skills who can work in teams, problem solve, and add value to society in every corner of the country has never been more important. The establishment and opening of technological universities will level the playing field when it comes to access to education, especially in regions that did not have a university up until now. The quality of higher education provision in Ireland is recognised as essential to our attractiveness to foreign direct investment. And this came up strongly on my recent trade missions to Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, where I got to meet people from Saudi and the UAE who'd studied in Irish universities. Therefore, it's vital that we put in place a sustainable funding model for higher education. And I think the Castle's report on the future funding for higher education is a wake-up call in that regard. Unfortunately, though, it is a reality that we have similar reports about dozens of other sectors. And of course, what's the optimum and perfect outcome for an individual sector isn't possible to do across all sectors. Resources, finance will always be limited, and it's not possible to do the optimum everywhere. And that requires us to make choices. Following the publication of the report, there was significant investment in higher education. This was following some very lean years in the wake of the global economic and financial crisis of 2008-2009. Annual current expenditure allocated to higher education has increased by more than 40% since then. And in 2022, the allocation for higher education will be in excess of 2 billion. To put that into context, that's roughly the budget for mental health and defence combined. So this is a significant allocation and is a demonstration of the government's commitment to meeting the funding needs of the higher education sector. But I fully appreciate that isn't enough. So it is clear that if we want to put in a long-term sustainable funding model for tertiary education, and we do need to do that, as the government, we've decided that that won't be in the form of higher student contributions or a system of student fees and loans. Student fees are already high by EU standards, and certainly I don't want to see students graduating with large debts in the way American students do. That just drives up costs, and I think students have enough to worry about after they graduate, like saving for a house and preparing for a pension, without being lumbered with very large student debts as well. Successful societies and economies will be those that invest and embrace talent, scientific research, and knowledge creation. This has never been clearer than in dealing with the challenges we face with COVID-19. Never before has the benefit of a robust scientific research community and international research cooperation been so important. The importance of increased collaboration within industry and between industry and academia is clear. Accessing the skills, expertise, technologies, and knowledge developed in the publicly funded research sector will enable businesses to develop faster and work smarter, and set new standards, grow jobs and sales, and stay well ahead of our competition. As you know, during the initial stages of the pandemic, the government's main research and innovation agendas developed a coordinated rapid response research and innovation programme to help mitigate and manage COVID-19. Funding of 47 million has been provided to contract researchers and research students whose work has been seriously disrupted by the pandemic. Ireland has a well-deserved world-class reputation for excellence and impact in numerous fields of research and innovation. And as a result of our commitment to R&I in past years, we've successfully built up research capacity and a significant reputation for research excellence. Our higher education institutions play a role in educating the graduates we require for the provision of essential public services. We must ensure that we step up to the mark and align provision to the significant workforce planning needs of the range of health and social care professions. Higher education institutions need to continue to assess how best to equip learners with the skills to navigate an increasingly digital world, and in a broader context, to make informed and responsible choices about their use of technology and social media. Technological innovations have the potential to enhance and transform the education experience for students and provide opportunities for pioneering approaches to teaching and learning. Building a digital capacity of the higher education sector facilitates the upskilling and reskilling of the workforce, which is imperative if we're to respond to the changing skill needs in employment. Following the 2020 July stimulus programme, over 4,000 additional places were made available on modular skills provision courses in 2021. Under Springboard Plus 2021 and the Human Capital Initiative Pillar 1, almost 13,500 places in over 400 courses are available to people seeking to upskill or reskill in the current academic year. The changes in the way of working brought about as a result of the pandemic underline the importance of the availability of high-level ICT skills. And in this context, Technology Skills 2022 aims to ensure that more than 12,000 people will graduate in higher-level ICT skills areas in 2022. On the legislative agenda, the Higher Education Authority Bill 2022 will see a major reform in the tertiary education sector, repealing as it does the 1971 Act and replacing it with a legislative framework enabling improved policy development and planning within the sector. There will be a focus on the needs of the learner and improved oversight and regulation of higher education institutions. It also provides crucial links to the wider tertiary education system. As a government, we want to improve innovation and enable you to adapt to the needs of the learner, advance equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I do recognise that more so than ever before, we have more people from non-traditional backgrounds accessing third-level education, which is hugely important. As you know, a comprehensive consultation process was undertaken stretching back to 2018, under which there was ongoing engagement with key stakeholders, including the association, through the legislative development process. The constructive and cooperative approach by your association and its members and other stakeholders has been very helpful and is much appreciated. And the legislation, when enacted, I think would have been greatly improved by your input. We understand that universities, technology universities, and institutes of technology are independent corporate entities established under statute, and we value their autonomy. However, they are, of course, in receipt of substantial state funding, and as part of its core legal function, the HEA is responsible for allocating recurrent funding to higher education institutions of 1.5 billion a year. Therefore, we have to bring a clear and specific definition to the relationship between your institutions and the state. Autonomy and independence are essential characteristics of higher education institutions, and I don't want to see that undermined in any way. But it does need to be matched with transparent governance at the institutional level, which discharges accountability to students, stakeholders, and the general public. The proper legislative framework needs to be in place to support the introduction of a new sustainable funding model, and that does have to come next once the legislation is enacted and commenced. Autonomous institutions are best placed to provide the education which will ensure talented, successful, innovative, and excellent graduates continue to emerge. So while we keep our eyes firmly on the future, we also need to take stock of the recent past and the lessons that we have learned during COVID-19. There's no doubt that the pandemic has shone a light on many areas of higher education and research that are in need of improvement and development. Overall, though, I'm very proud of the spirit of collaboration and the sharing of best practice among higher education institutions, both nationally and internationally. And I believe such collaboration should continue and expand. So to finish, thank you again. Your support, expertise, and dedication during a most difficult and challenging time really made a difference. Our challenge is not to return to the old normal, but rather to make our higher education and research sector better than ever before. We're aiming for the disruptive in the most positive sense, for agility and the ability to grasp opportunities when they arise. Higher education institutions must continue to be inclusive, diverse, innovative, and engaging environments where students of all ages and all backgrounds and abilities are encouraged to reach their full potential. We will prioritise making Ireland a leading global player in the area of research and the knowledge economy by investing in sustainable funding models into the future. So thank you once again to the Association for hosting this event, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you indeed for that, Tánaiste, and well said. Your comments are absolutely spot on about the debt of gratitude we as a nation owe the third level sector for everything they did during the COVID crisis. And can I also echo your comment about how welcome it is to see students back on campus, not least because it gets my 19-year-old out of the house for the first time in about 12 months. Tánaiste, I'm delighted to say is...
I find it hard to believe you're old enough to have a 19-year-old, Shane. But,
well, you're very charming. You're very charming.
must be a young father. Or a good skin regime.
I wish that were so. Listen, it's great that you're going to join us for our panel. I'm just going to quickly, before I come back to you, Tánaiste, just welcome our other panel members. Catherine Duffy is Senior Vice President and General Manager at Northern Trust Limerick, is also President of the American Chamber of Commerce for 2022. We have Professor David Fitzpatrick, who of course is President of TU Dublin and is the IUA representative on the National Skills Council, and Anne Herity, Non-Executive Director and Founder of CPL, a brilliant success story, and Chair of the IBEX Skills Council. By the way, you can use the Q&A and chat functions at the bottom of your screen if you want to add questions. We will try to get to some of those. Tánaiste, can I come to you first? And you've obviously referred to the Cassell's report and funding, and you spoke about talent and innovation and the greater emphasis we have on that now. I suppose particularly after the OECD framework on tax, where we've signed up to a 15% rate. You touched on the plans to significantly increase funding of third level. Can you give us more detail? What way are you thinking? There's been some speculation that it will reduce the contribution by students, that you might increase the SUSI grant. Obviously, that would be welcomed by parents. But I suppose the core question, and people listening this morning will want to know, will the package address that underlying problem of the deficit in core funding, notwithstanding the increases that you spoke about in recent years?
Yeah, well, I suppose I do think context is important, and as I mentioned in the speech, we had a 40% increase in funding in the past 10 years. We've also seen a very big increase in student numbers, and what people in the sector will say back to me directly is when you divide the funding by the number of students now, depending on your reference point, it's gone up or down. So I absolutely acknowledge that funding for students, depending on when you compare with it, is actually lower than it would have been in the past. But at the same time, from the point of view of government, $2 billion a year is not a small budget. As I mentioned, it's roughly equivalent to the mental health budget and the defence budget combined. It's multiples of the entire budget for tourism, arts, culture, sport and development, and it's roughly double my department's budget, which is enterprise, trade and employment, the department that is getting investment in enterprise and jobs and trade into the country. So underfunded, yes, but it's important to put that into a context and put it up against comparators. And one of the downsides, I suppose, of being in government is you'll often commission a sectoral report. There's one out today on the defence forces. Castles was a very good example of one in relation to higher education. There's one on pensions. I could give you any number of the amount of reports that we commission, and they're done really well, and they make really excellent suggestions and really excellent proposals. But the dilemma for government is that it's always what's best for that sector, or what the ideal solution for that sector is. But if you have 10 reports that say what's the best for 10 different sectors, there's no way you could possibly fund all 10. There just isn't the money, nor is there the people. So as a government, you have to try and decide, are you going to spread things thinly across those 10 areas, or are you going to pick sort of winners and losers areas that you're willing to cut back in order to increase in other areas? And that's a very hard decision for any elected politician to have to make. But to answer your question, the new legislation obviously is the most important step that is now pretty much done. And we would see the budget in October as a very important decision point in terms of the future of funding for third level, and something that I feel strongly about. The Taoiseach feels strongly about it too. He was very much behind the idea of setting up a dedicated department for further higher education, research and science. And whatever we do around the package, I think it has to have all three elements. Something on grants to improve grants, and that's happening in September anyway, but we're going to need to do more on that front. Certainly Minister Harris would like to bring down the student contribution. It is high by European standards. But if we do anything like that, we have to increase the core funding as well. Like we'd be shortchanging people actually if we improve the grant, reduce the student contribution, but didn't put additional substantial resources into higher education. Because whatever people think about the cost of higher education, it's a very worthy investment, and your earnings in return for that will be much higher. So I would think that however the minister decides to split things three ways, the focus should be on the core funding, in my view, but that's obviously to be determined between now and October.
Okay, so we are looking at the budget in October for an announcement on this. And can we take it from what you said there, Tánaiste? I accept the point about lots of competing demands on government resources, but that the increase in funding will more than make up for any, for example, cut in student contribution, that it'll certainly be in excess of any cut in that. There won't be any net decline in core funding, and the sector can look forward to some increase. I know you're not going to tell us the figure now.
Yeah, and it's not decided either. No, there will definitely be an increase in core funding and in core funding per student. It would be, as I said, a mistake to improve the grants, reduce the student contribution fee, and only have a small bit of money then for core funding. So core funding should be the priority of those three areas, in my view, because of the return on investment that you get from the core funding and the long-term value to the students themselves in terms of increased earning power. But there'll have to be an element of all three, realistically, and that does require choices to be made. Like one thing I've asked my colleagues, Minister of Finance, and others to examine in particular is the surplus in the National Training Fund. There's a €1 billion surplus at the moment in the National Training Fund. Employers have paid increased contributions in recent years. We increased the National Training Fund contribution by 0.1% every year for a couple of years. And employers say back to me that they actually don't mind that. You know, they didn't complain at all about having to make a bigger contribution to the National Training Fund because they see the value of higher education. But they say to me, legitimately, in my view, that it's unreasonable to ask them to make a further higher contribution while we maintain such a large surplus. So I think that's one of the areas that we need to examine between now and budget time, that if we are going to look for higher contributions, and everyone at the moment has a bright idea as to how they're going to increase employers' PRSI and fund everything with it, from pensions to childcare to higher education, I'd be very reluctant to ask employers to make a higher PRSI contribution or National Training Fund contribution when there's 1,000 in the surplus that isn't, 1,000 million in the surplus that isn't being deployed.
Okay, all right. Thank you indeed for that, Tánaiste. Do stay with us. I'd like to bring in Catherine Duffy now. Catherine, you're very much, I suppose, at the coalface in terms of young talent. How important, we've spoken a lot, I suppose, about third level, the importance of third level. How important is our talent as a driver for economic growth and indeed our competitiveness?
Great. So thanks very much, Shane, for that question, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Tánaiste and Andrew. Thank you for the lovely introduction there. So how important is talent? Our talent is absolutely key for economic growth and competitiveness, and it really, really is. So if you think about it, the future of work and investment will be as much as about where the talent wants to live as to where the business wish to locate. So knowing this, policy making, implementation and funding, we need to think about how we enhance the Ireland offering as a place where talent wants to live, wants to play, want to work, etc. So for example, housing, broadband, childcare, personal tax, physical and digital infrastructure, commuter ease, these are all real important factors for attracting talent to Ireland. On Tánaiste and the government, they will be very much aware of the AmCham members' view on this. And this includes, very importantly for me, and one of my priorities in this year in AmCham is the regional strategy priority. So i.e. talent across all of Ireland and not just Dublin. I think also the standard of education chain for our talent is absolutely essential. So nurturing that pipeline of talent through each tier of education is crucial. And this doesn't start the minute somebody goes into university. We want this back when they're in TY, making them step out of their comfort zone. Our great educators helping our students to pick subjects as they go into fifth year, even go back to primary, to encourage students. As we think about third level education and research, funding and preparing for the skills of the future are so crucial that we attract and we retain. We really want best in class educators while adequately equipping our graduates with the right skills. And then the last point I'm going to make on this one, Shane, is talent is on the move. We all know talent is on the move. As employers, we're all formulating our own future of work policies post-pandemic. So there are both challenges and there are both opportunities for employers with this great resignation that's going on. So talent is on the move. Employees are aware of their value, and us employers, we are really monitoring this very closely. Thank you.
Okay, really interesting, Catherine. Loads to think about there, and I might come back to the Tánaiste in a second on a couple of those points. But Anne, could I bring you in, Anne Herity, just on that same point, the importance of talent? You're also very much at the coalface when it comes to recruiting that talent. Your take on it?
Yes, Catherine's quite right. We have to make Ireland an attractive destiny for talent, because we're now very much operating in a global labour market. And I think, you know, one of the things that it's well established is that educational achievement is one of the best predictors of economic success, both for the individual, for the organisation, but also for the country as a whole. And I think there, Andrew mentioned in his opening about Ireland, how we now have among the highest number of students going into third level versus the EU. I think we have about 60% go to third level versus the EU around 40%. Whereas if you think back to the 1950s, that was closer to 5-6%. So I think it would be very hard to disconnect the impact of educational achievement and the quality of our education systems to separate that from the economic growth that we've had in Ireland over the last number of years. And I think the challenge now for us will be to maintain that competitiveness in a time when the world of work is changing and we are operating in a global labour market.
Okay, thanks indeed for that. Tánaiste, can I bring you back in here? Look, sometimes I think in this country, we think we're the only country that has, you know, problems with housing and infrastructure. But the point Catherine made about the need to attract talent, and Ireland needs to be a good place to live, and she mentioned housing and childcare and commuting and so on. They're key issues, and we do have a lot of work to do in those areas.
Yeah, they are, and you know, I think on balance, I think in the round, Ireland is a good place to live. And if you look at, you know, any UN index or OECD index, where, you know, out of 190 countries in the world, we're usually in the top 5 or 10 or maybe 15. But talent is enormously mobile, more so than ever because of technology. You know, my background is in medicine, as you know. Medicine has always been a global labour market, and people have always travelled the world to decide where they're going to work. That's increasingly true for pretty much everything now, largely because of changes in technology. So if we're going to attract talent and retain talent, we need to make sure that Ireland, our cities and all parts of our country are attractive places in which to live. That ranges from things around safety and security. Some cities and countries in the world are not very safe. Ireland is. We need to make sure it stays safe and gets safer. Personal tax is an issue. We're not a high tax economy, but for people on high incomes, we are. And that definitely is an issue. And we shouldn't allow ideological considerations to deny that basic fact. And that's why we've been reducing the amount of people's income that they have to pay at the highest tax rate. Quality of schools, really important for parents. Infrastructure is not up to scratch in Ireland. There's lots of reasons for that, but our transport infrastructure, our energy infrastructure needs a lot of investment, and we're doing that with the NDP. And then a thing we probably don't talk about enough, which is the whole area of culture and cultural life, you know, particularly for the younger workers who maybe don't have a family yet, and even those who do. The quality of restaurants, the quality of nightlife, the quality of things to do is really important, and you're competing with places like Barcelona, like Tel Aviv, you know, like New York, and that's hard. But that's all about making our cities livable and attractive, and I think they're the kind of plans we need to have.
Okay, thanks indeed for that, Tánaiste. Professor David Fitzpatrick, could I bring you in here specifically on the issue, and I do want to ask the Tánaiste about this as well. Our investment in research. If you look at the numbers, as a percentage, we're quite below the EU average. I think we're about 50% the EU average. And we fare even worse when we compare ourselves against other key competitors, small country competitors like Denmark and Finland. They invest 2 to 3 times more than we do. Is that something, David, that you're particularly concerned about in your capacity as president of TU Dublin?
Shane, yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely. TU Dublin, along with all the other technological universities, actually need to effectively double their research capacity and output within their first 10 years of existence. So it is a primary driver for me and the other TUs. But across the higher education sector as a whole, I think funding is always a challenge. Individual academics will always want more funding for their research. But I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the publicly funded research in Ireland punches above its weight. We provide output that is at a very high standard and has a very significant impact. The Tánaiste mentioned a few individuals who had contributed to our national efforts, but I think startups who initially would have been funded through public funding contributed to that in the development of antibacterial or antiviral coatings, for example. The Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, supported and driven by leading academics from within the research community in Ireland who would have worked on other infectious disease modelling initiatives and so on. So I think we have an impact that quite often isn't visible. And the IUA in 2019 published their impact analysis and showed that the then 7 members of the IUA showed a contribution of 8.9 billion euros per year into the Irish economy. And I think not all of that is research, but a significant proportion of it is. So I'm very pleased when we start in these sorts of conversations to use the words and the phrasings around investment and value for money and return on investment. I think that's how we actually need to start looking at this. Funded research isn't a cost. It isn't just a lost money. It has a significant return on that investment. And we need to do more to show that, and we can demonstrate that quite effectively. So definitely opportunity to build and generate more research capacity in Ireland, which then feeds into industry and the employment of our graduates. PhD graduates not only stay in academia anymore, they now move directly into industry roles, they move into NGOs and government bodies as well. So I think publicly funded R&D is actually critical in terms of developing and attracting the best talent into Ireland and then enabling us to keep them here within the ecosystem that we have. So I think fundamentally we have performed at a very high level, but we can do an awful lot more. And the research funding is for individual research activities, but also into the infrastructure and the other research capabilities that we need to have.
Okay, thanks indeed for that, David. Tánaiste, what about that? And I absolutely accept the point you made earlier. You've hundreds of different conflicting demands for funding and for income. But the point David makes that this is something you get a return on. And we need to spend more money on research. Particularly, we talk a lot about building a knowledge economy. We've got to back that up with hard cash, don't we, Tánaiste?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what we don't get a return on, except perhaps healthcare and palliative care and so on. But would anyone suggest that we cut that back? So I've yet to come across a spending proposal that doesn't have a return, whether it's a raw economic return or humanitarian or social return. Though it might be a few, but they don't spring to mind. I think one thing that perhaps my department can do and we can focus on a bit more is to try and get the big companies and both the Irish companies and the multinational companies to do more of their R&D here, because we've huge operations here in tech, in pharma, in medical devices, in lots of other areas, but don't do a huge amount of their R&D here. They do some, but not as much as they could. And I think that's definitely something that we can work on with IDA and Enterprise Ireland to find out why that is and how we can better incentivize more of that kind of value chain and value added development to happen here.
Okay. Do we just need to actually make a decision and say, you know what, research is going to be a priority? And yes, there are conflicting demands for money, but we're going to prioritize spending on research. Is that too simplistic?
It's not. I think that there's a great thing in government where everything's a priority, and there are key priorities and absolute priorities, and I'm not sure exactly what the hierarchy is between those different types of priority. But in terms of the public's priority, and ultimately we're accountable to the public. For the public, it's housing, it's climate. It's our health service, and increasingly at the moment is the cost of living. So we have to prioritise what's most important to the public, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that in order to generate income and generate wealth into the future, you have to prioritise things that perhaps the person whose door you're knocking on doesn't mention, and that includes things like research, and particularly includes education and higher education.
Yeah, and I accept that's it's a difficult it can be a difficult political message to send. Just finally on this, Tánaiste, just on more bread and butter issues. I hear complaints in the third level sector just about the lack of equipment that they have. They talk about the promises to reinstate the program for research in third level institutes. I'm hearing stories, I'm sure it's not across the board, but I'm hearing stories about floppy disks still being in use in areas of cutting edge research. That's something I imagine that could be done without huge expense. Does that need to become a priority?
It's something I hear about from time to time, but not hugely. If people are still using floppy disks, I'd be pretty concerned about that, but I'm sure that's the exception and not the norm. I definitely, one that we found in recent years that maybe we could be a bit smarter about is unspent capital budgets, and you'll often find that government departments towards the end of the year aren't able to spend their capital budgets. There was an underspend of 520 something million last year on capital budgets. You can carry some of it forward, but not all of it. And I wonder if we just need to be a bit smarter about using some of that money to buy equipment, because you can buy equipment quite quickly. And I know it's not an ideal solution, because it'd be much better if you had a dedicated budget and you could plan ahead, but it might be one of the ways that we could invest a bit more quickly.
Yeah, I'm sure that money would be put to very good use. Can I just change tack a little bit and maybe look into the future and the type of jobs that will exist maybe in 10 to 20 years' time? And I suppose we need to start planning for what skills we need for those jobs. And I suppose enterprise has a role in that. Universities have a role in that to inform future planning. Anne, can I ask you, do you think the current structures that are there between enterprise and third level, do they support that, building those skills for what we're going to need in 10 and 20 years' time, or do we have more work to do? Anne, are you there?
Sorry, Shane. Yeah, look, I do think there has been progress over the last number of years, but I think, predicting the jobs of the future in, for 10 to 20 years' time or whatever is more an art than a science. But I think, what we do know is that the pace of technology change is not going to slow down. And if we think that, according to the World Economic Forum, employers, they believe in 5 years' time will divide work evenly between humans and machines. And half of us will need to reskill in the next 5 years. Now, that's pretty phenomenal. So I do think there needs to be significant investment in the infrastructures, notwithstanding the good work that has taken place. And I think the universities have a huge part to do in that, not only do they deliver the education and skills training, but I think also the quality of the research environment and that transferability of skills between the campus companies and businesses. There's such an opportunity for both. That I think a really good focus on that. And, we've seen the success of campus companies like Inflazone and Upzone and Havoc. And, we've heard about the great contribution they make back to the economy. So I do think that university and business collaboration will be critical to Ireland's success and to the development of future skills. And I think building more awareness of the impact. I mean, it's a three-way thing between the individual, between business and between the individual, business and government in terms of how we achieve what we want to achieve in terms of the whole area of reskilling people. And I think having the technological universities has been a good step forward with their focus, with their industry-led focus on research. I think that's helpful.
Okay, that's a nice segue there, Anne, for me to bring in David, because David, that thing of that point Anne was making about upskilling, that is something that it's going to be key, and it's something I think that the likes of TUD have a huge role to play.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it is impossible to predict the future, so I think we have to take a broad approach as possible as we can, and so that we can enable people to adapt and flex their skills and their knowledge base in the right way. So that does mean that we need to start looking at how we put some monies into perhaps the more blue sky, exploratory research areas and the knowledge generation side of things, rather than focusing on the shorter to mid-term. I think that
must be difficult. That must be hard to do that, is it? Because all of us in our jobs, it's hard to see beyond the day to day, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are areas where I think enterprise and academia can come together and start developing things like horizon scanning approaches that are more in a more structured way than we perhaps have done to date. And I think positioning that sort of activity within the scope of a national strategy and a national perspective becomes really important, because fundamentally Ireland is a very small country. We perform exceptionally well in a number of key areas, but we need to develop strength and depth, and we need to develop capacity across those key areas. So coming together collectively is in everyone's interest. I think it's a rising tide lifts all boats when we do that.
Okay. Catherine, can I ask you Northern Trust's experience of collaborating with universities? Can you tell us what that's been and the benefits and the impacts of that?
Sure, Shane. So when we came down to Limerick in 2007, 2008, and I have to say we have, and I would call it a really strong partnership with UL, the University of Limerick, and TUS, the Technological University of the Shannon, Midlands and Midwest. And that didn't happen overnight. A real important part for us with the University of Limerick was the co-op program that they do. Year 3, you go out, you find yourself a work placement. In 2008, 2009, we started with 2 co-op programs, or 2 co-op students coming into this big building. Now we've over 50 that have joined us. It's a 9-month placement that they have with us. They like us, we like them. They go back and graduate, come back in and start working for us the following May. Part of our recruitment strategy. So that has had a huge, real positive impact on us. And pre-pandemic, we would send those students over to our Lux office and over to our UK office. So those students, they come in very quickly. They're dealing with real people, real monies. When they're going in September, I have a queue of people saying to me, we miss them. Can we backfill them? We missed what they did. And look, I have to say, in Northern Trust globally, and we've offices all over the world, does anyone else do that with a university? No. So it has a huge impact, a positive impact on us here in Ireland, and part of our recruitment strategy. Okay.
Tánaiste, do you want to come in on this? I know obviously from your medical training, the medical profession, there's lots of upskilling and lifelong learning in the medical profession, and probably in politics as well, I imagine.
Yeah, just less structured and not accredited, but I just think picking up on some of the other speakers, like it is really hard to predict what the skills needs of the future are going to be. It is probably more of an art than a science, as Anne said. Like at the moment, we have skill shortages in almost every part of the economy. Everyone is struggling to recruit at the moment. Now we'll see what happens as the EWIS and the PUP are phased out, whether that changes things or not, I don't know. We're certainly really working in my department to sort out the delays on work permits. We've trebled the number of staff working on that, and that should improve hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But the most critical deficits at the moment are in construction, care, which is care of children and the elderly, and also hospitality. And that's not just down to skills, it's also down to terms and conditions, and we shouldn't forget that aspect of it too. I think a lot of people who potentially used to work in hospitality now work in retail, where they're able to get better terms and conditions and a better quality of life. But I think the big thing that's going to change in the next couple of years is AI and robotics. Like the amount of things that can change, like even in medicine, which you mentioned, there's an awareness among medical students and doctors in training now that areas like radiology and pathology are areas where you have to think carefully about getting into, because we will always need radiologists and pathologists, but more and more the computers are able to read the x-rays, the MRIs, the CT scans. The computers are able to look at the slides and make the diagnosis, and that's going to very much change, I think, those roles. So, you know, we're used to kind of relatively low-skilled roles being automated or digitized. I think we're now going to see a big change where jobs that were previously done by people with degrees and masters can be done through AI and robotics, and that's going to be a pretty dramatic change. That's not going to happen in care and construction, by the way. Our hospitality, I think the robot waiter and the robot construction worker is much further away than the holographic or robot doctor. So you know, that's going to be a big change and a big shift, I think. Finally, I just think the other area that we can do more on is labour force participation. You know, we're seeing record numbers of women participating in the labour market now, but it's still lower than the European average. There are huge numbers of people with disabilities who would like to work and like to have a job, but they're not able to. And then there's the whole issue of people who are retired who might be interested and willing to come back and work part-time in addition to their pension. So there's potential labour pools there that I think we can activate and we can encourage and support, that we're not doing enough on at the moment.
Okay, hopefully it'll be some time off before we have robots as radio presenters, but who knows? Maybe there's
there'll be a chatbot soon enough that can do that, I'd say.
Yeah, probably, no doubt.
Maybe not well,
but Anne, can I just ask you? So we've got about 5 minutes left, guys. So just briefly to cover a few issues before we go, and I always think this is a tricky one. This the Tánaiste was talking about the importance of ICT graduates. Absolutely correct in that. Interesting survey out this week. 22% of those graduates in ICT cited a lack of experience as a barrier to employment. How do you get that balance right between, you know, it is a third level experience, but you kind of want them work ready when they graduate? What's your view on that, Anne? Do we need more practical stuff going on in third level?
Yes, I think we do. I think, you know, an employer will give preference to a graduate who has had, all things being equal, you know, similar degrees and all that, provided if they've already had a work placement. I believe employers will give preference to that. So I do think the universities should be proactive in trying to arrange opportunities for graduates in industry. But I think equally, graduates, even if they can't get experience exactly in their own area, the fact of getting some work experience while you're in college is very useful, because you come across as ambitious, as job ready, you understand what it's like to work, to be part of a team. So I do think it's pretty critical.
Okay, David, can I bring you in here? I sometimes think when people talk about skills that we sort of focus on apprenticeships and more technical skills. Like, do universities kind of need to reframe that narrative a little bit? Because I'm thinking of, I mean, you guys in TUD, you've engineers, you've architects. I mean, there's lots of skills there in the kind of stuff they do. Is there a need to reframe that narrative, do you think, David?
I think universities already have started that, and you know, if you think about the competencies that employers and you know, society are looking for, it's not just the specialist knowledge and the skills that go with that. They're looking for broader competencies around, you know, wide-ranging digital skills, communication skills, analytical skills. You know, they're all themes that are starting to permeate across all degree areas within the universities, not in any one institution. I think it's a broadly positioned pedagogical approach, and equipping graduates to be able to adapt with the changing work environment is a fundamental requirement for us, which I think also means we also as universities have to look at how we enable a much more accessible approach to lifelong learning. And so, for example, IUA members are looking at the micro-credentials, so short course. You're not committing to a multi-year program of study, you're doing small pieces of study to get a micro credential, which then can accumulate up over time. And this idea that, you know, the third level experience isn't just a 3 or 4 year experience now. It's something we have to get people to engage with for the rest of their lives, because retraining, reskilling and upskilling is a reality. And universities, higher education have a really significant role to play in that. So I think we're starting to move in that direction. There's a lot more we need to do, but absolutely, you're right. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, David. Just briefly, Catherine and Anne, can I just ask you about the challenges that companies are facing? The Tánaiste referred to it there, skills shortages. What kind of challenges are you facing, Catherine? Maybe to you first.
Yeah, look, I think we've covered them off. It's skill shortages, it's funding. 98% of AmCham members responded to a very recent survey saying that they are currently challenged in finding skills that they need to maintain their growth, and a particular focus on engineering, digital and language skills. So if we couple this with the Central Bank of Ireland's recent report advising that there's going to be up to 167,000 jobs could be created in the Irish economy over the next 2 years, it is really important that we address the current and already plan for the future of skills that we need down the track. So I think it's really, Shane, we need to plan ahead together. Collaboration is the word of the day. We need to plan companies, government and educators all together. And AmCham, and just I'll leave you on this point, AmCham has also advocated for continued support for lifelong learning, and strategies on lifelong learning should be linked with a national reskilling and upskilling strategy. So for us, it's really to plan ahead. Thank you.
And thank you indeed. Thanks indeed for that, Catherine. And very briefly on that.
Yes, hearing about skills shortages right across the board, from lower level skills right up to higher skills. And of course, there's significant wage inflation as a result of the demand for talent in the economy at the moment. And I think the concern will also be about our competitiveness if this is sustained.
Yeah, Tánaiste, just last word to you. That is a real challenge at the moment, isn't it? Competitiveness in an inflationary environment.
Yeah, it is. But the inflation environment is not unique to Ireland. So if costs were just rising in Ireland and not rising everywhere else in the world, you'd be much more worried about our cost competitiveness and our relative cost competitiveness. But inflation is rising in every advanced economy. That's not to dismiss the real impact on people's lives, which is very real and is hitting family budgets very hard, or to dismiss the impact on business. But competitiveness, by its very nature, is relative, and I don't think it's going to cause us to lose out in that sense. But it just shows the extent to which it's a problem that a national government can't actually solve. We can deal with a lot of the symptoms, but it's going to be international action and changes in monetary policy that ultimately get it under control.
Okay, Tánaiste, thank you indeed for that. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We're just right on time. We said we'd have you all out and done by 1 o'clock, and we're just coming up. It's just hit 1 o'clock now. I found that, I hope you agree, I found that a really fascinating, interesting discussion. I'd like to thank our guests. They are all very, very busy people, so thank you for giving up your time. Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, Catherine Duffy, Anne Herity and David Fitzpatrick. Thanks also to Professor Deeks for the opening comments. The Future of Ireland event series will continue throughout the year. Check iua.ie and at IUA official for details. That's our lot for today. Thanks for your company. Take care.
Very much.